I was hauling a refrigerated load out of El Paso, frozen chicken, 42,000 pounds of it, and the plan was simple. Get to San Antonio by morning, drop the load, grab a few hours at a proper truck stop, and deadhead back west by afternoon. Simple, clean, the kind of run you do in your sleep because you've done it so many times it stops feeling like work and starts feeling like just existing at 62 miles an hour. But somewhere past Van Horn, around 9:30 at night, the fatigue hit me like a wall. Not the normal kind of tired where you crack a window or turn the radio up and you're fine. This was the other kind. The kind where your eyes are open but your brain is somewhere else entirely. The kind that kills people. I'd been running since for that morning and I'd pushed it too long and I knew it and I kept telling myself the next town, the next exit, just a little further. The way you do when you're stubborn and behind schedule and you think you're tougher than you actually are. I got on the CB and asked if anybody knew a good pull-off between Van Horn and Fort Stockton. A couple of guys came back. One said there was a rest area coming up, maybe 40 miles ahead. Mile marker 109. And then a second voice, older guy, real slow and flat the way some of the long-haul guys talk. Like they've seen enough that nothing surprises them anymore, said, "You can stop there." But I wouldn't. I asked him why. He didn't answer right away. There was maybe 10 seconds of static. Then he just said, "Just keep moving if you can, brother," and clicked off. Now here's the thing about CB advice at 9:30 at night when you're exhausted and alone on a dark Texas highway. You don't always take it as seriously as you should. I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind and told myself the man was probably just superstitious. Old truckers get that way. They've got rules about everything. Don't park under overpasses. Don't idle facing east. Don't stop at mile marker 109, apparently. I figured it was one of those things. I pulled in anyway. The rest area appeared out of the dark like most of them do on I-10. A single overhead sign, a deceleration lane, a row of yellow lights in the distance. I eased the rig in, geared down, and rolled to a stop near the far end of the lot away from the building. Standard practice. You park away from the building, away from the light, because the light attracts people and people attract noise and noise kills sleep. I sat there for a second with the engine idling and looked around. There were 3 other vehicles in the lot. 2 passenger cars and what looked like a panel van, white, no markings. All 3 were parked, dark, engines off. No movement. I didn't think anything of it at first. People sleep at rest areas. That's what they're for. But here's what made me pause, and I want you to stay with me on this because it matters. None of the cars had condensation on the windows. You know how when someone's sleeping in a car, you can always tell? The glass fogs up. Body heat, breath, moisture, it happens within 20 minutes. Always. These cars had been sitting in that lot long enough for the engines to cool, long enough for the asphalt around them to be completely dry, and not one of them had a single fogged window. Either nobody was in them, or they'd been parked there for hours without a single living person inside. At night, in the middle of nowhere, on a rest stop that a man on the CB had told me to avoid without explaining why. I told myself I was tired and reading into things. I killed the engine, set my alarm for 4 hours, climbed into the bunk, and closed my eyes. I don't know exactly when I fell asleep, maybe 10 minutes after I laid down. The kind of sleep that takes you fast when your body's been running on fumes. No easing into it, just gone. Dead quiet in the bunk. The way I like it. I woke up at exactly 2:14 a.m. Not because of the alarm, because of the knock. One knock, hard, on the passenger side door of the cab. I lay there in the bunk for a second with my heart going, brain trying to catch up with what had just pulled me out of sleep. Could have been anything. A branch. Road debris. Could have been the truck settling. Old rigs make sounds. I talked myself through it the way you do when you want something to be nothing. And then it happened again. Same spot. Passenger door. 3 knocks this time, slower, deliberate. I sat up. Now I want to be straight with you. I'm not a man who scares easy. I've been doing this for a long time. I've had people try to break into my cab at a rest stop in New Mexico. I've had guys try to wave me down on dark roads for reasons that had nothing to do with needing help. You learn to read situations in this job. You learn fast or you learn the hard way. What I felt right then wasn't fear exactly. It was something colder. The kind of alertness that shuts everything else down and makes your whole body go very, very still. I didn't turn on the cab light. That's the first thing, never turn on the light. You light yourself up, you go blind to what's outside, and whoever's out there can see everything. I shifted to the passenger seat and looked out the window from the side. Not straight on. Nobody there. I scanned the lot. The 3 vehicles were still in the same spots. Still dark. Still no movement. The overhead lights were flickering now. One of them had gone completely out since I'd pulled in. The lot felt smaller in the dark. More closed in. I looked for shadows. Looked for movement near the rear of the trailer. Looked toward the building, the bathrooms, the covered picnic area. Nothing moving. Nothing I could identify. I went back to the bunk, sat on the edge of it, and thought about what to do. What I did was, I started the truck. Not because I had proof of anything. Not because I could point at something specific and say that's the threat. But because every instinct I had, and 18 years of highway miles buys you some real instincts, was telling me that parking in that lot until morning was not a smart decision. The knocked windows said one thing. The dead lot said another. The man on the CB said a third. All 3 were telling me the same story, and I'd already ignored them once. I wasn't going to ignore them again. I pulled out of that rest stop at 2:17 in the morning, got back on I-10 heading east, and drove to Fort Stockton. Pulled into a Flying J, parked under the lights in a full lot with other rigs, and slept for 5 hours without moving. A week later, I was talking to a driver I know. Been running the I-10 corridor for about 12 years, and I told him the story. The knock, the cars with no fog on the windows, the whole thing. He didn't look surprised. Not even a little. He told me there had been a string of incidents at that rest stop over a few years. Cargo thefts mostly, guys who'd case the lot, wait for a solo driver to fall asleep, and then either break into the trailer or, in at least 2 cases he knew of, try to get into the cab directly. He said the operation was organized. Multiple people. They'd wait in vehicles that looked abandoned. Watch. Wait. Pick the right target. He said, that knock was them checking if you were sleeping heavy. He said a lot of drivers knew about it. Said it had gotten passed around on the CB network the way those things do. Not as a formal warning, just as common knowledge among people who paid attention. The older guy who'd told me not to stop there that night almost certainly knew exactly what he was talking about. I asked why nobody had done anything about it. Why the rest stop was still open, still on the maps, no warning signs. He shrugged and said, nothing's ever been proven. Nobody who got hit there wanted to file a report and lose the time. You know how it is. I do know how it is. That's the part of this job nobody puts in the brochure. You lose a load, you lose time. You file a report, you lose more time. You end up sitting in a county sheriff's office in West Texas for 6 hours trying to explain your logbook to a deputy who has no idea what a CMV compliance report is. And meanwhile, your dispatcher is calling every 20 minutes, and your delivery window is closing, and nothing about the situation gets better by you being there. So drivers don't report. They just pass the word. Don't stop at 109. That's how the system works. Word of mouth on an AM frequency, somewhere between Van Horn and Fort Stockton at 10 o'clock at night. I've driven that stretch of I-10 probably 30 times since then. Maybe more. And every time I come up on that exit, mile marker 109, rest area, quarter mile, I see the sign in my headlights and I think about those 3 cars sitting dark and still in that lot. No fog on the windows, like they'd been there for hours, like they were waiting. I keep driving every time. Don't even lift my foot off the accelerator. I don't care how tired I am. I'll white-knuckle it all the way to Fort Stockton before I pull off at mile marker 109 again. The load was clean. I want to start there because everything that happened that afternoon makes a lot more sense when you understand that going in. The load was completely 100% documentably clean. 41,000 pounds of packaged lumber out of a mill in Central Oregon, consigned to a hardware distribution center outside of Albuquerque. Legal weight.
Propetia duns.
Bills of lading signed, dated, and in order. Pre-trip done at the yard before I ever left. I had been running compliant loads for 11 years at that point, and I knew what a clean truck looked like because I drove one every single run because I had no interest in the alternative. US 50 through Nevada is one of those roads that reminds you how big this country actually is. They call it the loneliest road in America, and that's not marketing. That's just accurate. You can go 40, 50 miles without seeing another vehicle. The basin and range just keeps repeating itself, mountain then flat then mountain then flat, and the sky out there is so wide it stops feeling like sky and starts feeling like something else entirely. I'd run it maybe a dozen times before, knew the rhythm of it, knew the way station just outside of Ely, knew to pull in, get weighed, get my green light and keep moving. That's how it was supposed to go. I pulled onto the scale at 2:40 in the afternoon, handed my paperwork through the window, waited, standard 60 seconds, maybe 90, green light back on the road, done. Instead, the speaker crackled and a voice said, "Pull around to the inspection bay. Leave your engine running." I did what I was told. The officer who came out was a compact guy, mid-40s maybe, with a clipboard and the particular kind of unhurried walk that people develop when they've had authority in a small place for a long time. Not aggressive, not friendly either, just settled. Like a man who knew exactly how much power he had in that specific patch of Nevada and had made peace with enjoying it. He started with the exterior walk-around. That's normal. I stood by the driver's door and watched him go. He checked the tires, checked the lights, checked the conspicuity tape on the trailer. He spent a long time at the rear axle, longer than usual. I watched him crouch down, look at something, stand back up, write something on his clipboard, and move on without saying a word to me. That's when I got the first feeling. Not alarm exactly, just attention. The kind that sharpens your focus without you deciding to sharpen it. He came back around to the front and asked for my logbook. I gave it to him. He flipped through it slowly. I knew there was nothing wrong in it. I ran paper logs at the time and I was meticulous about them, had been for years because I'd seen what happened to guys who weren't. He spent about 4 minutes on the logbook. 4 minutes is a long time to spend on a logbook that has nothing wrong with it. Then he said, "Your last 34-hour restart. Looks like you may be short." I told him I wasn't. Told him exactly when I'd gone off duty, exactly when I'd come back on. Gave him the dates and times from memory because I knew them. He nodded slowly, like he was considering it, and wrote something else on the clipboard. Then he walked to the driver's side steer tire and crouched down again. Stood up. Said, "This tire's looking low." I told him I'd checked pressure that morning at the yard. Told him the reading. He said, "Looks low to me." And right there, that specific moment, standing in a gravel inspection bay outside of Ely, Nevada, at 3 in the afternoon with nobody else around, I understood exactly what was happening. Not suspected. Understood. Because there's a difference between an officer who finds something wrong and an officer who is looking for something to find. And by that point in my career, I knew what the second one looked like. The walk was different. The clipboard work was different. The way he said things without quite making direct accusations, that was different too. Everything had the texture of a performance. A slow, practiced, completely deniable performance. He went up into the cab next. Asked permission first, they have to. And I gave it because I had nothing to hide and refusing just makes everything worse. I stood outside and listened to him moving around in there for about 6 minutes. When he came back down, he had 3 things written on his clipboard. The logbook discrepancy, the tire pressure, and a third item, a crack in the windshield that he said might obstruct the driver's view. The windshield crack was real. I'll give him that one. It was maybe 4 inches long, up in the upper passenger corner, well outside my sight line, and I'd been meaning to get it fixed. But it was not an obstruction violation. Not remotely. I'd had a DOT inspector in Idaho look at that exact crack 8 weeks earlier and not even mention it. He looked at his clipboard, looked at me, and then he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "This is going to be a long afternoon for you unless we can find a way to simplify things." He didn't say anything else after that. Just let it sit there between us. Now I want you to understand what that sentence is. It's not an offer. It's not a direct bribe. It's a door left open. Carefully worded, completely deniable, just ambiguous enough that if you react badly, he can say he was only talking about paperwork. He's done it before. Probably does it twice a week. Has the whole thing calibrated down to a science. How hard to push, when to back off, who's likely to play along and who isn't. I looked at him for a second and said, "Write the violations." His face didn't change. Not even a little. He just nodded and went back to his clipboard. What followed was 3 hours and 40 minutes of the most deliberate, methodical, unhurried inspection I have ever experienced in 11 years of driving. He checked every single tie-down strap on that load. He measured the lumber stack height. He re-examined the logbook twice. He had a colleague come out and check the tire pressure with a gauge. The tire was fine, as I had told him, and when it came back fine, he wrote something down without acknowledging that I'd been right. The logbook discrepancy turned out to be a 6-minute gap in my record that he argued could be interpreted as a documentation error. 6 minutes. I showed him my fuel receipt with a timestamp that accounted for those 6 minutes. He looked at it and said, "Receipts don't substitute for proper log entries." By 5:30, I had 2 citations. The log entry documentation issue, which was going to cost me somewhere around $400 to contest and probably $600 to just pay and move on. And a secondary citation for the windshield, which I genuinely hadn't expected him to actually write. I thought that one was just leverage. Total time lost, 3 hours and 42 minutes. Delivery window in Albuquerque, missed by 2 hours. Penalty from the receiver for a late delivery. Docked from my settlement. Total financial damage from that one stop. Somewhere north of $800 when you added everything together, not counting the hours. I pulled out of that way station at 5:48 p.m. and got back on US 50 heading east, and I didn't say a word for probably 40 miles. Just drove. There's a particular kind of anger that doesn't need to make noise. The kind that sits in your chest and burns clean and cold, and that's what I had. Not the explosive kind. The kind that calcifies into a decision. I called a driver I knew who ran US 50 regularly. Told him what happened. Didn't even finish the story before he said the name of the officer. Described him exactly right. Mid-40s, clipboard, unhurried walk. Said there had been at least 4 other drivers he knew personally who had gone through variations of the same stop. Said the word was out on him, had been for a while, but that nothing had come of it because nobody could prove anything. Every violation he wrote was technically a real violation, just selectively enforced on people who said no to the simplified version of things. I asked if anyone had filed a complaint. He said, "A couple guys did. Takes months to go anywhere and nothing ever really happens." I asked him what drivers did instead. He said, "They take 93 north and cut over on 50 east of Ely. Adds about 40 miles. And that's what I've done every single time since. 40 extra miles every run. Not because I'm afraid of the citations. I'll fight every citation that man ever writes if I have to. But because there are 8 hours in a driving day and I'm not giving a single one of them to a performance I didn't ask to see. 40 extra miles. Every run. Without any hesitation. Some roads aren't worth the shortcut." He warned me before I ever took that route. Said, "Beautiful road, ugly ending." I thought he was being dramatic. He was one of those older drivers who'd been running the Four Corners region since before I had a CDL. The kind of man who didn't say much, but when he did, it landed with a particular kind of weight that you learn to pay attention to over time. We were sitting in the driver's lounge at a terminal in Farmington, New Mexico, and I had a load going up to Cortez, Colorado, and I was looking at the map trying to decide whether to take US 491 north or loop around the longer way on 64 and hit the highway further east. US 491 was 40 minutes shorter. The math seemed obvious. He looked at my route and said what he said. "Beautiful road. Ugly ending." Then he went back to his coffee. I asked him to explain. He thought about it for a second and then he said, "Wind comes off the Chuska Mountains in a way that don't make sense until you're already in it. And by then you're committed." He said the road ran through a kind of corridor between the high desert and the mesa country where the terrain funneled the wind in ways that the weather didn't predict and the maps didn't show. Said it hit broadside, sudden, without warning, and on a high-profile rig it was like someone reaching down from the sky and pushing your trailer sideways with one hand.
I nodded like I understood.
Took US 491 anyway. There's a particular kind of stupid that comes from being competent. You've driven enough difficult roads, handled enough bad weather, come through enough situations that would have rattled a less experienced driver, and slowly, without meaning to, you start to believe that experience is the same thing as immunity. It isn't. Experience just means you've been lucky long enough to accumulate it. The first 40 miles of US 491 north of Gallup were exactly what he described. Beautiful. The landscape out there is the kind that makes you forget you're working. Red rock formations, wide open sky, the Shiprock Formation rising up out of the flat desert to the west like something that had no business existing. I had the windows cracked and the radio low, and I was thinking this was one of the better runs I'd had in a while. Which is, of course, exactly when it happened. I was coming up on a long left-hand curve north of Shiprock, the kind of curve that looks gentle on the map but stretches out long and exposed with nothing on either side to block the wind, when I felt the trailer move. Not drift, not shift, move, like something had grabbed the rear end and pushed it 3 feet to the right in less than a second. I've thought about what happened next probably hundreds of times, and I still can't fully account for the time. They say your body reacts faster than your brain in those moments, and I believe it now in a way I didn't before, because I don't remember deciding to do anything. I just found myself already doing it while turning into the push, foot off the accelerator, eyes tracking the shoulder, everything happening in a compressed half-second that felt both instantaneous and very, very long. The trailer swung. I felt the drives lighten up on the right side, that unmistakable sensation of tires starting to lose their argument with the road. Any trucker who's felt it knows what I'm talking about. It's not a sound exactly, and it's not quite a feeling. It's more like an absence. The road stops pushing back the way it's supposed to, and for one fraction of a second you are making a decision that you won't be able to undo. I steered into it and held. Didn't overcorrect. Just held pressure and let the rig work through it. The trailer came back. Not gracefully, not smoothly. It came back the way a heavy thing comes back when it's been pushed to the edge of its tolerance. Reluctantly, with a sway that took another 3 or 4 seconds to fully settle. I had drifted maybe halfway into the oncoming lane by the time it was over. There was no oncoming traffic. If there had been, this would be a different kind of story. The kind that doesn't get told in first person. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. I sat there with the engine running and both hands on the wheel, and I didn't move for probably 5 minutes. Not because I was frozen, just because I needed to let my body catch up to the fact that the crisis was over. My hands were shaking. Not badly, but enough to notice. My heart was running about 20 beats faster than usual. The wind outside was still going, rocking the cab in slow, steady pulses, like it was reminding me it was still there. Here's what I kept thinking about. Sitting on that shoulder with the dust blowing across the road in front of me, I kept thinking about 3 men. The first one was a driver I'd worked alongside at a carrier out of Albuquerque about 6 years before. Good driver. Careful man. He rolled a loaded flatbed on US 491 on a clear day in October. Crosswind. Exactly what I'd just felt, except his trailer went all the way instead of coming back. He survived. His back didn't. He never drove again. The second one I knew less well. Met him twice at a fuel stop in Farmington. Talked for maybe an hour total. Big guy, quiet. Ran produce out of Arizona. He hit the same stretch I was sitting on now about 3 years back. Different outcome. The investigation said wind event. High-profile trailer. Unmarked gust. Driver overcorrected. He was gone before anyone got there. The third one was someone I'd known a long time. We came up together, got our CDLs the same year, ran similar routes for a while before he moved to a different carrier. He took US 491 on a delivery to Durango 2 years ago. He didn't roll. He avoided the roll and then overcorrected on the recovery and went into the guardrail on the right side. Spent 11 weeks in a hospital. Walks with a cane now. Says he'll drive again someday. Hasn't yet. 3 men. Not one of them was careless. Not one of them was inexperienced. Not one of them made a bad decision in the obvious sense. They took a legal road with a legal load, and the road did what it does, which is punish high-profile rigs in crosswind conditions with a completeness that doesn't leave much room for error. And I had just been sitting in the same spot they'd been in. Same road, same wind, same trailer swinging out to the right like it had somewhere else to be. The difference between my story and theirs was about a half-second of reaction and the absence of oncoming traffic. That's it. That's the whole margin. I pulled back onto the road and drove the remaining 60 miles to Cortez at 55 miles per hour, both hands on the wheel the entire time, Every bit of attention I had pointed outward at the road and the sky and the way the grass was bending on the shoulder. I watched for the places where the terrain opened up, watched for the way the dust moved on the flats to the west. The old driver in Farmington had been right. The wind didn't telegraph itself the way it did on open interstate. It came from the gaps between the mesas and pulses, and you felt it before you saw any indicator of it, and by the time you felt it you were already in it. I made it to Cortez without further incident. Backed into the dock, got my paperwork signed, found a diner and ordered coffee and sat there longer than I needed to. The dispatcher called when I was heading back south and asked if I wanted to run another load up from Farmington the next afternoon. I told him I'd take it, but I was routing around US 491. He asked why. I said the road conditions didn't suit my equipment. He said, "It's a clear forecast." I said, "I know." He didn't push it. Dispatchers learn after a while that there are certain things experienced drivers won't negotiate on, and the smart ones don't make it a conversation. I've been asked since then if the road is really that dangerous or if I'm being overcautious. And I understand the question. On a calm day, it's a perfectly reasonable road. Nice scenery, decent surface, makes sense on the map. But roads don't come with guarantees, and US 491 has taken enough from enough good drivers that I don't feel the need to keep testing my luck on it. 40 minutes saved on the front end doesn't mean much if the wind decides today is the day it takes everything back. Every time someone tells me it's just a back route, just a shortcut, just a 2-lane through the desert, I put 3 names in my head. Say them quietly. Remember what careful looked like on each of them. 3 names. Same road. I take the long way now. We pulled off the main road just outside Plaquemine because the customer's address said River Road, and I thought, how bad can it be? I want you to hold onto that sentence. I want you to remember that I, a grown adult with a commercial driver's license and 11 years of experience and a perfectly functional brain, looked at the words River Road, Plaquemine, Louisiana, and thought to myself, how bad can it be? I want you to understand that this is where the whole thing started, and everything that came after was a direct consequence of that single moment of casual, catastrophic optimism. It was a Tuesday in late September. I was running a partial load of industrial piping heavy stuff, about 31,000 pounds, on a 48-foot flatbed, consigned to a manufacturing facility that the paperwork described as being on River Road near the Iberville parish line. The GPS on my dash routed me off Louisiana Highway 1 and down into Plaquemine proper, and I followed it the way you follow GPS when you're in unfamiliar territory and you're tired and you have a delivery window in 2 hours and you figure the technology knows things you don't. The technology did not know things I didn't. The first sign that things were going sideways was the road itself. River Road in that part of Louisiana is not a road in the way that truckers think about roads. It's a road in the way that someone in the 1940s built a road along the levee without giving any thought to the possibility that one day a 48-foot flatbed might need to use it. 2 lanes, barely. Live oaks on both sides with roots that had spent 80 years lifting and cracking the asphalt into a surface that felt less like pavement and more like a strong suggestion of pavement. Shoulders that weren't shoulders so much as immediate drops into drainage ditches. I slowed down. I got careful. I told myself it would open up. It did not open up. About a mile in, the road bent left and I came into what I can only describe as the older residential part of town. The part where the streets were laid out before anyone had a car, let alone a truck, and where the passage of time had added houses and fences and telephone poles right up to the edge of the road without anyone ever reconsidering the width. I had maybe 2 feet of clearance on each side. 2 feet on a flatbed with a wide load is not comfortable. It is the kind of clearance that requires you to hold your breath slightly, which I know is irrational and doesn't actually help, but you do it anyway. I crept through the first block. Made it. Crept through the second block. Made it. Block 3 had a pickup truck parked halfway onto the road outside a house on the left. I stopped. I sat there and looked at the situation. The pickup was old, sitting on the road like it had been there since the Clinton administration, and the gap between its rear bumper and the fence on the right side of the road was... I got out and measured it with my eyes and then with my body, walking the gap with my arms out, about 9 feet. My flatbed was 8.5 feet wide, not counting the load overhang. I was not going to fit. Now here's what you do in this situation as a professional. You stay calm. You assess your options. You consider reversing. You consider finding someone to move the truck. You consider calling dispatch. You do not, under any circumstances, try to squeeze through a 9-foot gap in a vehicle that is 8.5 feet wide plus load overhang because the math on that does not work no matter how much you want it to. I knocked on the door of the house. Nobody answered. I knocked again. A dog barked somewhere inside. Still nobody. By this point, a few people from neighboring houses had come out onto their porches. This is the thing about certain small towns. The moment something unusual happens, an audience materializes from nowhere. 3 people on porches within 60 seconds. None of them moved to help. They just watched with the particular expression of people who have seen this exact situation before and found it entertaining. I asked the nearest one if he knew whose truck that was. He thought about it for a second, genuinely appeared to think about it like it was a difficult question, and said he wasn't sure. I asked if there was a wider road I could back out to. He pointed back the way I came and said, "That way." I said, "Is there anything that way that I should know about before I start reversing a 48-foot flatbed through 2 blocks of residential street?" He thought about it again, said, "Not that I can think of." What there was, in fact, was a telephone pole that had been replaced since Google Maps last photographed that street, now sitting about 18 inches further into the road than the satellite image showed. I found this out the hard way about 40 feet into my reverse when my left rear trailer corner made contact with it at approximately 2 miles per hour. Not a crash, more of a firm introduction. The kind that leaves a mark and costs money and makes a sound that you feel in your back teeth. I stopped, got out, assessed the damage. Scrape along the rear corner, nothing structural, nothing that was going to end the day, but absolutely the kind of thing that required paperwork and a conversation with the insurance people that I was not looking forward to. And then I looked up and realized that while I'd been dealing with the telephone pole situation, I had completely failed to notice the road ahead of me, the direction I'd originally been going, past the parked pickup and what was on it. There was a railroad bridge, a low railroad bridge. The clearance sign on it said 11 feet 6 inches. My load was 13 feet 2 inches. I stood in the middle of that street in Plaquemine, Louisiana, in the September heat, with a scraped trailer corner behind me and a 13-foot load in front of a bridge that topped out at 11.5 feet, and I had what I can only describe as a very quiet, very complete moment of understanding about how bad it could actually be. I called dispatch, explained the situation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then my dispatcher said, "How did you get in there?" And I told him I'd followed the GPS, and there was another pause, and then he said he'd call me back. He called back in 12 minutes. Said the customer's actual facility was accessible from Highway 1 via a separate industrial entrance on the north side of the property. Said the River Road address on the paperwork was a mailing address, not a delivery address. Said this information had been in the delivery notes on page 2 of the consignment documents. I had not read page 2. I want to be honest about that part. The GPS led me in there, yes, and the road had no business being on any truck route, yes, and the parked pickup and the telephone pole and the unmarked bridge were all genuine contributing factors. But I had not read page 2 of the consignment documents, and if I had read page 2, this would not be a story I'm telling. I was still stuck in that street with no room to go forward and a telephone pole behind me on the left and drainage ditches on both sides and an audience of about 6 people now who had brought out lawn chairs. Actual lawn chairs. At some point in the previous 20 minutes, people had decided this was worth sitting down for. The man who helped me was older, came out of a house about halfway down the block, walked up without any fanfare and said he'd seen this before and he knew a way out if I was willing to trust him. He had me pull forward about 12 feet to a point where there was a slight widening in the road next to a vacant lot, then talked me through a 17-point turn, and I am not exaggerating the number I counted, that got the nose of the truck pointed back the way I'd come. He walked every inch of it with me, hand signals, calling out my clearances on both sides, completely calm, like this was just a thing a person did on a Tuesday afternoon. Took 40 minutes. When it was over, I had clearance on both sides and a straight reverse back to Highway 1, and I could have cried with relief, which I did not do, but I understood in that moment why people do. I shook the man's hand and thanked him. He waved it off and said, "GPS does this to y'all about twice a month." Said it like it was just a fact of living on that road. Said there'd been a driver 2 summers ago who didn't spot the bridge in time. Said they had to bring in a crane. 3 hours and 14 minutes. That's how long the detour cost me. Missed the delivery window. Scraped trailer corner. One mirror clipped on the way back out through the first block. Caught a fence post I'd somehow missed going in. Load delivered eventually via the correct industrial entrance on the north side, exactly as page 2 of the consignment documents had specified. I called dispatch from the receiver's dock after I'd unloaded and told them I needed that account flagged in the system. Told them the River Road address needed a permanent note. Not accessible by flatbed. Use north industrial entrance only. Do not trust GPS routing. Then I told them something else. Next time that customer orders freight, and I said this clearly without any particular anger, just as a statement of fact, somebody else is doing it. I don't care. I'd stopped at the Roost maybe 5 or 6 times before I started paying attention to my receipts. That's the part that bothers me most when I think about it now. Not what they were doing, I'll get to that, but the fact that they'd probably been doing it to me for months before I caught it. Every stop, every fuel up, quiet, consistent, small enough that it didn't trip any alarms on its own. The kind of thing that only becomes visible when you're looking for it, and most drivers aren't looking for it because most drivers trust that the number on the receipt matches the number on the pump, because why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't it? The Roost sat right off I-40 about 8 miles west of Shamrock, Texas. One of those truck stops that exists because the geography demands it, not because anyone particularly wanted to build something there. Middle of the Texas Panhandle, nothing for 30 miles in any direction. Fuel prices about 4 cents higher than the Flying J back in Amarillo, but positioned perfectly for drivers who didn't want to wait until Amarillo to fill up. It had a diner attached that did a decent chicken fried steak and kept the coffee fresh, which in that part of the world is enough to build a loyal customer base. I'd eaten there half a dozen times. Fueled there probably the same. Tipped the counter staff. The whole thing. I was eastbound on a Tuesday in March, running a drive-in load of auto parts from Albuquerque to Oklahoma City, and I pulled in around 11 in the morning to top off the tanks and grab lunch. Fueled first, that's always the routine, fuel before you eat so you're not sitting with a full stomach when you're trying to hit a pump correctly. Ran the company fuel card, watched the gallons tick up, pulled forward, went inside. Ordered the chicken fried steak. Got my coffee. Sat at the counter the way I always did and looked at the receipt from the pump while I waited for the food. The receipt said I'd taken on 142 gallons. I looked at it for a second and then I looked at it again. My tanks were not that empty. I knew they weren't that empty because I'd fueled in Albuquerque the previous afternoon and I'd run about 400 miles since then. My rig gets roughly 6.5 miles per gallon loaded. 400 miles at 6.5 per gallon is roughly 62 gallons. My tanks hold 150 total. I started the day with somewhere around 90 gallons. I should have taken on maybe 60-65 gallons at the outside. The receipt said 142. Now the first thing I did was the reasonable thing, which was to assume it was a pump error. Pumps malfunction. Receipts print wrong. I've seen it before. I finished my lunch, because I wasn't going to let a potential billing issue ruin a perfectly good chicken fried steak. And then I went back to the counter and asked the cashier to pull up my transaction. The cashier was young, maybe 23, and she had the particular quality of someone who had been coached on exactly what to do when this question came up. Because she didn't blink, didn't hesitate, didn't look confused. She looked at her screen and said, "Shows 142 gallons, sir. Pump 4. I told her that wasn't possible given my tank capacity and my mileage since my last fill. She said, "The pump shows what the pump shows." I asked her to call the manager. Here's where it shifted. Here's where the whole thing changed texture. The manager came out from the back, middle-aged, unhurried, wearing a button-down with the diner's logo on it, the kind of man who seemed comfortable in a way that takes years of practice to achieve. And he listened to me explain the discrepancy with the expression of someone who had heard this exact conversation before and had a very well-rehearsed response ready. He said pump equipment sometimes read differently based on temperature variance and fuel expansion. Said it was a known issue with certain pump models in high-altitude or temperature-variable environments. Said it with the confidence of someone who had spent time making sure that sentence sounded plausible to someone who didn't know better. I knew better. Fuel expansion doesn't add 80 gallons to a receipt. Temperature variance doesn't double your fuel consumption. That's not how physics works, and it's not how pump calibration works, and the fact that he delivered that explanation with a straight face told me everything I needed to know about how often he'd delivered it. I pulled out my phone and opened the fuel card app. The transaction was already posted. $621.40 for 142 gallons at the current diesel price. My actual fuel cost should have been somewhere around $270. The difference was $351 and some change. Gone from the company account already processed, sitting on a posted transaction that would require a formal dispute to reverse. I looked at the number on my phone, and then I looked at the manager and I said, I want this transaction reversed. He said he couldn't reverse a completed fuel transaction. I said, then I want the district office number for this location. He said this was an independently operated location and he was the district contact. I said, then I want your name and the contact information for whoever holds your operating license. And here is where the conversation went somewhere I hadn't expected. He leaned on the counter slightly, not aggressive, not threatening exactly, but deliberate, and he said quietly, Sir, I'd encourage you to think about whether this is really worth your time. These things can get complicated for everyone involved. I want to be precise about what he said because I've repeated it a lot since. Not a threat. Nothing that would hold up if I recorded it and played it to a lawyer. Just a sentence. A carefully constructed, completely deniable sentence designed to communicate exactly one thing. That I was outnumbered and far from home, and the simplest version of the situation was the one where I got back in my truck and drove away. I took a picture of the receipt. I took a picture of the pump number. I took a screenshot of the posted transaction on my phone. I wrote down the address of the location and the name on the operating license that was hanging on the wall behind the register, the one piece of information he hadn't been able to prevent me from seeing. Then I said thank you and walked out. I called my fleet manager from the parking lot. Explained everything. He said he'd file a dispute with the fuel card company and escalate it through the carrier's compliance department. Said it could take 4 to 6 weeks. Said there were no guarantees. I called a trucker I knew who ran I-40 regularly and told him what happened. There was a pause on his end and then he said, The roost off Shamrock? I said yes. He said, yeah, just that. Yeah. Like I'd confirmed something he'd suspected for a while. I asked him what he knew. He said he'd heard things. Not specifics, just patterns, drivers mentioning higher than expected fuel charges at that location, usually in the 60 to 90 gallon range over what they should have taken. Nothing dramatic enough to make someone certain it was intentional rather than equipment error, which was probably by design. Keep the skimming small enough that each individual instance looks like it could be a mistake. Spread it across enough transactions. Make the dispute process painful enough that most people just absorb the loss and move on. He said he'd stopped fueling there about a year ago and just told people on the CB to bypass it. Said the word was out among the regulars, but new drivers and out-of-towners didn't know. The dispute took 7 weeks. The fuel card company reversed $290 of the $351 overcharge, which they characterized as an adjustment without formally acknowledging fraud. The remaining $60 they said fell within the acceptable variance range for fuel transactions. I don't know what that means, and I don't think it means anything other than $60 was the number below which they didn't want to keep arguing about it. I filed a complaint with the Texas Department of Agriculture, which oversees fuel pump calibration in the state. Received a form acknowledgement letter 6 weeks later. Nothing came of it that I ever heard about. I put the word out on every CB channel I used between Amarillo and Oklahoma City. Told every driver I knew who ran that stretch. Fuel at the Loves in Shamrock if you need a top-off. Bypass the roost completely. Not worth it. The place is still open. Still sitting right there off I-40, 8 miles west of Shamrock, with a lit sign and a full parking lot most days. I drove past it about 4 months after the incident and there were 6 rigs parked out front. 6. Fueling, eating, going about their day. I looked up the location online once, just curious. 5 stars on Google. 47 reviews. People raving about the chicken fried steak. Figure that one out. I've hauled through Montana in January. I've done the Grapevine in a snowstorm with a full load of produce and ice on the road and visibility down to 40 feet. I've run the Eisenhower Tunnel in Colorado in weather that had every sensible driver pulled over at the chain-up area waiting it out. I've been in situations on the road that required everything I had and then a little more on top of that. Nothing scared me like sitting dead on Highway 93 with no signal and a temperature gauge buried in the red and the outside thermometer reading 107 degrees. Nothing. This was a Thursday in July. I was running a load of commercial HVAC equipment from a distribution warehouse outside of Las Vegas to a construction site in St. George, Utah, about 125 miles as the crow flies, longer by road depending on which way you went. The standard route was I-15 north out of Vegas, straight shot, easy, done in 2 hours on a normal day. But it was a Thursday afternoon in the middle of summer and I-15 north of the city was backed up from an accident near the interchange at Apex. And my dispatcher had already called twice asking about my ETA because the construction crew was waiting on the equipment to continue work and every hour of delay was costing the customer money. I looked at the map. Highway 93 north out of Kingman cut up through the Arizona Strip and crossed into Utah near the Nevada border, eventually connecting to I-15 above the traffic. On paper, it saved somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours depending on conditions. I'd never run it with a loaded rig, but I'd seen it on maps enough times that it felt familiar in the way that things feel familiar when you've looked at them but never actually done them. I took the Kingman exit and headed north on 93. The first 20 miles were fine. The road was decent, 2 lanes, well-maintained, nothing dramatic. The landscape out there is high desert transitioning into plateau country, all red rock and Joshua trees and the occasional dry wash cutting under the road. Big sky. Long sight lines, the kind of scenery that makes you feel like you made a good decision because everything looks clean and open and manageable. 50 miles in, my phone showed 1 bar of signal. I didn't think much of it. 60 miles in, it showed no bars. I thought slightly more about it but told myself I'd be back in range within the hour. 70 miles in, I passed a small sign indicating the next services were 94 miles ahead. I did the math on that. 94 miles of nothing. I looked at my fuel, fine, I topped off in Kingman, and I looked at my water situation, which was less fine. I had about a third of a bottle left from breakfast, which in a climate-controlled cab on a normal run was plenty. In 107-degree heat in the middle of the Arizona Strip with no services for 94 miles, it was not plenty. It was the kind of not plenty that you don't fully appreciate until you're sitting still. The fan belt snapped at mile marker 71. I heard it go. A sharp crack followed immediately by the squeal of the cooling system losing its drive, and then the temperature gauge started climbing with a speed and purpose that made my stomach drop. I had maybe 90 seconds before the engine temperature hit the critical zone and I needed to be stopped and shut down before that happened or I was looking at a seized engine on top of everything else. I got the truck to the shoulder, killed the engine, set the brakes. And then I sat there and took stock of exactly what my situation was. No engine, no air conditioning, which in a cab sitting in direct sun at 107 degrees becomes relevant information very quickly. No cell signal, approximately 1/3 of a bottle of water, a load of commercial HVAC equipment that I could not deliver, and a road that in the 45 minutes since I turned onto it had produced exactly 3 other vehicles going the opposite direction, none of which had slowed down. I got out and looked at the belt. Clean snap, no fraying, the kind of failure that happens without warning and can't be diagnosed in advance. The belt itself was replaceable. I carried a spare for the serpentine but not for the fan specifically, and even if I'd had the right belt I was going to need the engine cooled down before I could work on it, which in 107-degree ambient heat with no shade was going to take time. I put out my triangles, got back in the cab, left the windows down. Here's what 107 degrees feels like inside a truck cab with no air conditioning and no engine running. It feels like sitting inside something that is trying to make a decision about you. The heat doesn't come from one direction. It comes from everywhere at once. From the dashboard, from the seats, from the air itself, from the road surface radiating up through the floor. Within 10 minutes, my shirt was soaked through. Within 20 minutes, I'd finished the water. Within 30 minutes, I was rationing my thinking, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, staying as still as possible, doing the math on how long a person could sit in that heat before it stopped being uncomfortable and started being dangerous. The answer, in case you're curious, is not as long as you'd think. I watched the road. One car passed in the first hour, going south, opposite direction, moving fast. I had my door open and my arm out and I waved, but they didn't slow. Either they didn't see me or they made the decision that most people make on an empty highway when they see a broken down truck, which is that it's someone else's problem and they have somewhere to be. I understood it. I'd probably driven past broken down trucks myself without stopping. You file it away as not your situation and you keep going. I understood it completely and I was furious about it in the specific way you're only furious about things you recognize in yourself. Second hour. Nothing. The temperature inside the cab had stabilized at somewhere around the same as outside, which was not a stabilization so much as a surrender. I had moved to the sleeper berth where there was slightly more shade from the overhead bunk and I was lying as still as I could manage, thinking about water with the single-minded focus that dehydration produces, which is a remarkable thing. How completely your brain abandons every other concern and narrows down to one word. Water. The vehicle that stopped was an older pickup truck, faded white, heading north. It pulled off maybe 30 feet ahead of me and a man got out. Older, maybe late 60s, work clothes, the kind of person who looks like he was built specifically for remote desert environments. He walked back to my rig without any particular urgency and looked at the situation with the calm assessment of someone who had seen broken down vehicles on Highway 93 before. He had a 5-gallon water cooler in his truck bed. He gave me 2 full bottles without being asked. I drank one of them almost entirely before I said thank you, and he waved it off like it was a normal thing to do, which out there I suppose it was. He also had a satellite communicator, a small orange device on a lanyard that he wore around his neck the way some people wear a key. He said he ran cattle in the area and had carried one for 15 years because out on the Arizona Strip a satellite communicator wasn't optional equipment. It was the same category of thing as having brakes. He let me use it to send a text message to my dispatcher with my GPS coordinates and the nature of the breakdown. He waited with me for 40 minutes until he was satisfied I'd made contact and had enough water to be all right. Then he said he had to get moving, got back in his truck, and drove north. I didn't get his name and he didn't offer it. He just helped. The way people used to help before helping became complicated. The service truck came from Kingman, 4 hours and 20 minutes after the breakdown. The repair itself took another hour and 40 minutes in the field. By the time I was moving again, it was 9:30 at night and the construction site in St. George had long since shut down and the delivery had been rescheduled for the following morning, which meant I needed a place to sleep in the area, which meant another day burned. 3 days total from departure to final delivery. 2 hours saved on paper. My dispatcher asked if I'd take the 93 route again on future St. George runs. I told him no. He asked why not, since the breakdown could have happened anywhere. I told him the breakdown could have happened anywhere, but the consequences of that specific breakdown in that specific location with no signal and no services in 107-degree heat were not the same as the consequences of the same breakdown on I-15 with 3 rest stops and a Flying J within 20 miles. Context matters. The road you break down on matters. What's around you when things go wrong matters more than people think until the moment it becomes the only thing that matters. I carry a satellite communicator now. Same kind the cattle rancher had. Orange on a lanyard around my neck on every run. $65 a month for the service plan. Worth every cent of it. And I take I-15 out of Vegas regardless of the traffic. Shortcuts are just long ways home with extra suffering built in. Dispatch said simple Manhattan drop, 8 a.m. window, you'll be out by 10. I want you to understand that I have not forgiven him for that. Not the sentiment, not the optimism, not the casual, breezy confidence with which he said the words simple Manhattan drop, as if those 3 words belonged in the same sentence. I have thought about that phone call many times in the 2 years since it happened, and every time I think about it I arrive at the same conclusion, which is that my dispatcher had either never been to Manhattan with a truck or had been to Manhattan with a truck and was the kind of person who processed trauma by pretending it hadn't happened. Either way, I should have asked more questions. I was running a loaded 53-footer out of a textile warehouse in Newark, bolts of fabric, about 38,000 pounds, consigned to a fashion company with a receiving address on West 37th Street in the Garment District. I'd been driving for 14 years at that point, ran the Southeast Corridor mostly, some Midwest, occasional Southwest when the loads worked out. I had never in 14 years delivered into Midtown Manhattan. I had driven through New York exactly once on I-95 at 2 in the morning, which is a completely different planet from what I was about to experience and prepared me for it approximately the same way that swimming in a backyard pool prepares you for open ocean. I crossed into Manhattan via the Lincoln Tunnel at 7:48 a.m., which felt like good timing. 12 minutes to spare. Simple. The GPS took me up 9th Avenue and then, through a sequence of decisions that I still cannot fully reconstruct, routed me east on 42nd Street. If you have never driven a 53-foot trailer through the intersection of 42nd Street and 7th Avenue at 8 in the morning, I want you to picture the most chaotic, compressed, signal-ignoring, horn-using, personally motivated pedestrian traffic you have ever seen in your life, and then I want you to add about 400 more people and remove any suggestion that any of them are aware that a vehicle weighing 80,000 pounds is attempting to make a right turn 6 feet away from them. Times Square at 8 a.m. on a weekday is not a place. It is a condition. It is something that happens to you. I sat through 3 light cycles at that intersection. 3. Because the pedestrian volume during the walk signal was such that I physically could not complete the turn without making contact with someone, and during the don't walk signal approximately 40% of the pedestrians continued crossing anyway on the private understanding that don't walk was a suggestion rather than an instruction. A cab driver behind me leaned on his horn for so long and with such commitment that it stopped sounding like a horn and started sounding like a philosophical position. I got through the intersection on the 4th cycle. I am not exaggerating the number. By the time I found West 37th Street, it was 8:34. I was 34 minutes into my 2-hour window and I hadn't started unloading yet. I located the loading dock. It was on the south side of the building, accessed via a narrow one-way street that required a backing maneuver into the dock from a block where parallel parked vehicles on both sides left me approximately 11 feet of working width for a truck that needed 14. There was already a truck in the dock. A refrigerated straight truck, not a semi, backed in tight, engine running, nobody visible in the cab or on the dock. I pulled up as close as I could without blocking the intersection entirely and waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nobody appeared. I hit my horn once, short, polite, professional. Nothing. Hit it again. A guy appeared on the loading dock, looked at me, disappeared back inside without any acknowledgement that I existed or that time was a thing that mattered. 15 minutes later, the straight truck pulled out. I began my backing maneuver into the dock. This took 22 minutes. I want to be specific about that number because I think it communicates something important about the geometry of the situation. 22 minutes to back a 53-footer into a single dock on a one-way street in the Garment District while pedestrians walked behind my trailer during the maneuver with the calm certainty of people who have decided that a reversing truck is not their problem. I had my four-ways on. I had my backup alarm going, that continuous beeping that is specifically designed to alert people to the fact that a large vehicle is moving toward them. 2 separate people walked directly behind my trailer, close enough that I could see them in my camera, while the backup alarm was actively sounding. One of them was on his phone. He didn't look up once. I was parked, finally, physically in the dock, at 9:17 a.m. 43 minutes used. Still time, I told myself. Still workable. I went inside to find the receiving manager and get my paperwork signed so we could start unloading. The receiving manager was a compact, fast-moving man who gave the impression of someone who had decided years ago that everyone who came through his dock was specifically there to make his day worse. He looked at my bill of lading with the expression of a man reading a document that has personally offended him, flipped to the second page and said, "This is the wrong form." I told him it was the form the shipper had given me. He said, "We require a vendor-specific receiving form. Your shipper should have known that." I said, "Can we get that form now and fill it out?" He said, "My system's down." I stood there for a second and then I said, "When will it be back up?" He said, "IT's working on it." I went back to my truck, called the shipper. The shipper said they'd submitted the correct paperwork through the customer portal 2 weeks ago and it wasn't their problem if the receiver's system was down. Called dispatch. Dispatch said they'd reach out to the customer's logistics coordinator. I sat in my cab and watched the street and waited, and while I waited a parking enforcement officer appeared from nowhere. I mean that with complete sincerity, there was no one on that street and then there was a parking enforcement officer, as if the city had materialized one specifically for me, and began writing a ticket for my truck. I got out and explained that I was actively making a delivery, that I was in the dock, that this was a commercial vehicle on a commercial delivery. She said the dock permit for that address allowed a maximum 45-minute loading window and I had been there. She checked her device, 51 minutes. I had been in the dock for 34 minutes at that point. I told her that. She showed me her timestamp, which showed my truck in the block. Not in the dock, in the block. From the moment I'd arrived and been unable to get into the dock because of the other truck. The ticket was $165. I took it, put it in my folder with my other paperwork, and went back to my cab with the specific inner stillness of a man who has accepted that the universe is not currently on his side and struggling against it is only going to cost more energy than he has. The receiving system came back up at 11:20 a.m., 2 hours and 3 minutes after I'd first presented my paperwork. The receiving manager processed my documents in about 4 minutes, which suggested that when the system was working, the whole thing was not actually that complicated. He did not acknowledge the wait. He handed me back my copy of the bill of lading and pointed to the dock door and said, "Bay 2. The unloading took an hour and 40 minutes because the receiving crew was 2 people short and the pallet jack they were using had a slow hydraulic that meant every loaded pallet took about twice as long to move as it should have. I helped where I could. I am not above helping unload when the situation calls for it, and the situation called for it. I pulled out of the dock at 1:06 p.m., 4 hours and 32 minutes after my scheduled arrival. 5 hours and 18 minutes after I'd entered Manhattan. The delivery window had been 8 to 10 a.m. I finished at 1:05 in the afternoon. My logbook looked like a document that was trying to apologize for itself. The drive back to the Lincoln Tunnel took 47 minutes because there was a water main issue on 10th Avenue that had traffic consolidated to 1 lane for 6 blocks. I sat in that line and watched the city go about its business around me, the food carts and the delivery cyclists and the people walking fast with coffee cups, the whole grinding machinery of a place that has no particular awareness that any individual person is having a difficult time inside it. And I thought about the fields outside of Cookeville, Tennessee, where I grew up, and the Tulane County roads I learned to drive on, and how none of that had prepared me for this, and honestly, nothing could have. I called my fleet manager from the Jersey side of the tunnel, once I had space to breathe. Told him about the dock situation, the wrong paperwork, the system outage, the ticket, all of it. He listened. When I finished, he asked if I'd be available for a similar run the following week. Same shipper, different consignee, also Manhattan. I told him I would do it under 2 conditions. Double the rate, and someone else checks the delivery notes on page 1, page 2, and every other page before I leave the yard. He said he'd see what he could do on the rate. I said the rate wasn't a negotiation. There was a pause. He said, "Okay. I want to be clear that I don't have anything against the city. People live there. People work there. Freight has to move there like it moves everywhere else, and somebody has to move it, and I understand that. But I'm a highwayman. 4 lanes, open road. A load going somewhere that has a reasonable dock and a receiving crew that expects me. That's what I do. That's what I'm built for." I told my fleet manager exactly that. Double my rate or find a city driver. I don't do that. The guy at the fuel stop in Metairie looked at my rig and said, "You're not taking the Huey, are you?" Like I'd said I was going to swim across. I told him it was the most direct route to the delivery address on the East Bank. He looked at my trailer, 53 feet, standard width, loaded with commercial kitchen equipment. And then he looked back at me with the expression of a man who wanted to say something but was trying to decide how much of another person's education was his responsibility. He settled on, "Your call." Went back inside. Didn't elaborate. I should have followed him inside and made him elaborate. The Huey P. Long Bridge carries US 90 across the Mississippi River in Jefferson Parish, just west of New Orleans. It's a double-decker structure, rail on the lower deck, vehicle traffic on the upper, and it was built in 1935, which tells you most of what you need to know about how its engineers thought about lane width. They thought about it the way people thought about things in 1935, which is to say they thought about the vehicles that existed in 1935, which did not include 53-foot semi-trailers. The bridge is just under 5 miles long. The travel lanes are 11 feet wide. 11 feet. My truck is 8.5 feet wide. That leaves 1 foot and 3 inches of clearance on each side. On a standard road, 1 foot 3 is uncomfortable but manageable. On a bridge over the Mississippi River with a concrete barrier on your left and oncoming traffic 18 inches to your right and a drop of 135 feet to the water below. 1'3" is not a measurement. It's a dare. I pulled on to the on-ramp at 10:42 in the morning. The first thing you notice on the Huey is that the bridge doesn't feel the way bridges usually feel. Most big bridges have a certain engineered solidity to them. The road surface feels planted, substantial, like it knows what it's doing. The Huey feels different. It moves. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register on any instrument, but in the way that very old steel structures move when loaded weight passes over them. A subtle, continuous flex that you feel through the seat and the steering wheel, a reminder that what you're sitting on is not ground. It is a constructed thing suspended over a very large amount of water, and it has opinions about how much weight it prefers to carry. I dropped to 30 miles an hour and put both hands on the wheel and looked straight ahead. The lanes on the Huey are separated by a painted line. Nothing physical. No barrier between you and oncoming traffic. A sedan passed me going the opposite direction, and I felt the air displacement from it even at 30 miles an hour. That slight pressure shift as a vehicle moving 60 miles an hour passes within 4 feet of your driver's door. Then a pickup. Then another sedan. Each one close enough that I could have read the passenger's expression if I'd been willing to take my eyes off the road long enough to look, which I was not. About a mile and a half in, with the Mississippi spread out below me in both directions and the New Orleans skyline visible to the east, something shifted in my rear axle. Not a catastrophic sound. Not the crack of a structural failure. More of a change in the vibration profile, a new frequency mixed into the normal road noise, something that wasn't there before and now was. I felt it more than heard it. That specific wrongness that experienced drivers develop a sensitivity to over years, the same way a mechanic can hear an engine and tell you which cylinder is misfiring. Something had changed in the rear of the truck. I maintained speed. On a bridge with no shoulder and oncoming traffic 4 feet to my left and 135 feet of air below me, maintaining speed was the only rational option. Stopping would have been more dangerous than whatever was happening in the rear axle, and I knew it, and I drove on the knowledge of it, and the knowledge was not comfortable. Half a mile further, the tire let go. Right rear drive axle, outer tire. Not a blowout in the explosive sense, no bang, no sudden violence. A rapid deflation, the kind that happens when a tire has been running hot and the structure finally gives way, and the effect on the truck was immediate. The rear end dropped slightly on the right side and the steering went loose in a way that is very specific to rear tire failure on a loaded rig. A softness that communicates itself straight up through the wheel into your hands, telling you that the back of your truck is no longer planted the way it was 3 seconds ago. I held the wheel. I kept my speed exactly where it was. I looked at the lane markers and I looked at the concrete barrier to my left, and I did not look at the water below because looking at the water below was not going to help anything. The thing about a dual tire setup, which is what drive axles run, 2 tires on each side, is that when the outer tire fails you still have the inner tire carrying load. You don't lose control. You lose confidence, which is a different thing, and you lose some stability and you gain a handling characteristic that requires constant correction. But the truck stays on the road if you keep your inputs smooth and your speed consistent and your hands exactly where they need to be. I kept my inputs smooth. I kept my speed consistent. My hands did not move from the wheel. The remaining 3.5 miles of that bridge were the longest 3.5 miles I have driven in my life. Every vehicle that passed me going the opposite direction was a small crisis. The air displacement, the narrowing of available space, the reminder of how close everything was. The bridge kept moving beneath me in its subtle, continuous way. The rear end kept handling differently than it should. The Mississippi stayed 135 feet below, patient and enormous and completely indifferent to whether I made it across or not. I came off the bridge on the east bank at 11:09 a.m., 27 minutes after I'd pulled onto the on-ramp. I pulled into the first wide spot I found, a gravel area outside what looked like a warehouse property. Set the brakes, and sat there. My hands were still on the wheel. I noticed that and put them in my lap. They were shaking in a fine, continuous way that didn't stop for about 4 minutes. I watched them shake and I breathed and I thought about the fuel stop guy in Metairie saying your call and going back inside, and I thought about what your call had actually meant, and I thought about the 135-foot drop and the way the bridge moved and the specific feeling of that rear tire deflating under me at the midpoint of a structure built in 1935 over the widest river in North America. I called for a road service truck to come change the tire. Took 40 minutes. While I waited, I looked up the Huey P. Long Bridge on my phone and found several trucking forums where drivers had discussed it with the kind of passionate specificity that topics earn when they've scared enough people enough times. Threads going back years. Clipped mirrors, scraped trailer sides, drivers who'd had to be talked through it by CB because they'd frozen mid-span. One thread from a driver who'd had a blowout on the bridge, outer rear drive, same as mine, and described the experience with a vividness that made me feel like I was reading my own morning back to myself. The tire got changed. I made my delivery, got my paperwork signed, did my post-trip. On the way back west, I added 45 minutes to my route to cross the Mississippi at the Crescent City connection instead. Wider lanes, more modern structure, a bridge that was built with the understanding that time would change what drove across it. I've run the New Orleans area probably 20 times since that morning. The standing rule for my rig is the Crescent City connection going east, the Crescent City connection going west, full stop. Dispatchers have asked about it. Other drivers have told me the Huey isn't that bad once you know what to expect. One guy told me I was being dramatic. I told him, drive it loaded in an 80,000-pound rig with a tire going soft at the midpoint and then tell me about dramatic. He didn't have a response to that. 45 minutes the long way around. Every single time. No exceptions. Not negotiable. If the story hit different, if it made your hands grip something tighter, then you're already one of us. This is Black Fears. We bring you the dark, the real, and the stories people don't talk about in the daylight. Subscribe, hit that bell, and stay close because the next story is already waiting for you in the dark.